Hey everyone, this is James Lindsay, and you are listening to the new Discourses podcast, and it's time to talk about Vladimir Lenin, arguably one of the most famous communists of all time. Lenin was the head of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia that took power in 1917, and he frankly defined, almost as much as Marx did, the direction of communism for the 21st century, and arguably much of what we see today in the woke movement is derived from Lenin's ideas. Now, a lot of people don't know, and this isn't the podcast to get into the details of it, but Lenin and Stalin, for example, which seem pretty far removed from woke, you would expect people who support woke to make fun of you for invoking Lenin and Stalin while you talk about their new kindly, gentle socialism, or whatever they think woke actually is. It's just caring about people. But the fact is that in 1921, 2, and 3, so very early in Soviet Union, before Lenin even died, Lenin and Stalin were outlining a program that we would now recognize as DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. The three words translated from Russian, which I will not attempt in Russian now, are diversity for diversity, literally the Russian word for diversity, and then actual, it starts with the F phoneme in Russian, actual equality in place of equity, and then what's called indigenization for inclusion. And when you read about these programs, you can see how overwhelmingly similar they were at the time to what we consider to be DEI today, which is fairly shocking. More than that, not just is it that they have this tremendous overlap, so much so that it's likely that they're just repackaging. Lenin and Stalin both wrote in the early 1920s, again, 21, 22, 23, that this program, particularly the indigenization part of the program, but also the goal of so-called actual equality, which is not just economic equality, but also social and cultural equality for all the people, including the ethnic and racial minorities and the so-called backwards peoples of Russia, to overcome the Great Russia chauvinism, which is like white supremacy in the CRT model today, that this was their second most important program for development of Soviet Union. But that's a story for another day. I have a feeling I'm going to talk about Lenin quite a lot. I know some of you guys, just as a matter of housekeeping, are sort of in the thread of me. I've begun going through this book, The Future of Mankind by Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who I've characterized as basically the religious philosopher of the modern left. And I will go back. I read the first chapter of that book to you in a podcast recently. I will go back to Teilhard. In fact, I'll probably go back and forth between Teilhard and Lenin, which is a kind of a weird thing to do. But basically, as I've read further forward in The Future of Mankind, what I'm finding is that the next few chapters after that first one, which was a doozy, are not particularly interesting in their totalities. So I'm going to pull from them and see which parts are more interesting and which parts are less, and put together a presentation that covers several chapters at once. Don't worry, it could still be quite the mighty podcast series. The book has, I forgot even how many chapters, 20-something, some absurd number of chapters. So let me see, actually, real quick. I have it here. Chapter, 22 plus a conclusion. So we'll come back to Teilhard. Don't worry about that. But for now, I'm going to start with Lenin, and not characteristic to my style, I'm going to start in the middle. In 1917, in between the two revolutions in Russia, there was an interim government set up that boxed out the Bolsheviks, and so Lenin was currently not in power during, say, August and September, and during that time he wrote a pamphlet, which is an extraordinary expression of his thoughts about the state and revolution. And in fact, that's the title of the pamphlet. Now, when I say pamphlet, you might consider it a short book. It's 88 pages, organized into chapters. It has 6 chapters. There was a 7th that was allegedly going to be as long as the entire thing again, but I don't know if he didn't finish it or if it never got written or what. I forgot the story on that. It doesn't really matter. And I've always found, not that I've read this in depth over many years, the only part of it that I had ever read before a couple of months ago was chapter 5. And that's because it's quoted on Marxists.org as the basis for the Marxist understanding of the concept of democracy, which, as you know, because we have to defend our democracy, and Elon Musk is dangerous to our democracy, and Joe Biden took our democracy back from Donald Trump. We know that the word democracy is some weird term that the woke are using in some peculiar way, and I've been trying to make the case that it largely stems back to Lenin's use of the word democracy, which is based off of Marx's and Engels' use of the word democracy. And where Marxist.org make that point is in chapter 5 of Lenin's 1917 book, short book or pamphlet called The State and Revolution. Now, I've read the majority of this now, recently, and some of it more than once, the first 2 chapters a couple of times. And I think that there will be more podcasts. I don't know if I'll go through all of this, but since this is a podcast series and people can come back and listen in whatever order they want, I don't have to do them in order. So I'm not going to. I'm going to read chapter 5 first, and that's going to be the subject of this podcast. Now, the beginning has, this is one of the reasons I didn't really want to jump in and just start going after Lenin since I started reading him, is that you've got to he refers to a lot of people. Marxists are kind of constantly having arguments, or socialists in general are kind of constantly having arguments with other socialists about the right way to do socialism. Marxism is just one approach. There are the utopian socialists that Marx trashed. There was crude communism from so-called Gracchus Babeuf in France during the French Revolution. There are lots of different approaches to socialism. And there's a lot of kind of context dumped on you at the beginning that it's a lot to explain and tangential to the point. So I'm going to just kind of read through that so you can hear it, not that it matters, and summarize just barely what's going on. Not that I'm even that well versed. There's just so many, here he only mentions 2, but in general, there's so many characters and so much going on. There's so much history to know. We're peeling an onion here. But anyway, chapter 5, the economic basis of the withering away of the state. And so this is kind of the paradox that Lenin's trying to figure out. What is the role? The thing is called the state and revolution, right? So what is the role of the state as we go through, or as the Bolsheviks go through a revolution, as they move from in Russia, it turns out a feudal society, but in Marx's more specific vision, a capitalist society, and do a literal violent revolution and take power by seizing the means of production and transform it into a socialist society, as we'll probably come back to at some point because it's important. Early in the earlier chapters, chapters 1 and 2, that issue is brought up a lot. What's the difference between a state and a socialist state, or a socialist semi-state, as Lenin calls it? And the difference is that they do a switcheroo on the definition of state, and they split the concept of state into a bourgeois state versus a proletarian state. This is a typical communist trick, right? Okay, so you have this idea of a state. We have a vague idea of what it means, and it's something to do with the government and the way the government is run. And that's as much as a normal person's going to think about it. They're probably not going to get into a nitty-gritty political science definition of the state and all of its various manifestations and forms. And so they know it's something. It's basically the operation and application of the government. Okay, so that's the state. And they say, well, actually, we can't just talk about the state because the state does different things in different places at different times. The state, they argue, or Lenin argues, building off of Engels in particular, is a product of its time. And in fact, it's not just a product of its time in the typical Marxist circular fashion where man is creating society, but society is creating man at all times. It's not just that the state is a product of its society. It also becomes the guarantor of its society. And I mean that in a specific way to understand their intention. What the state does is it actually embodies all of the class conflicts going on in the current social environment, and it prevents them from spilling over into violence, or in other words, it prevents revolution. So their definition of a state is the consummation and evidence of class antagonisms that are it's the body that then maintains the class antagonisms by keeping them in a stable level of acceptable or within acceptable boundaries of behavior. So no violent revolution, for example. And so the state is a product of its society, but it is also a guarantor of maintaining the society the way that it already is. In other words, preventing revolution, or in the Marxist, word of the century, transformation to another form. So, for instance, a feudal state, which is probably going to be a kingdom, a monarchy, is designed specifically to resist transformation into a capitalist mode with a large middle class. The royalty will be the royalty, and they will lord, literally that being the word, lord over the serfs who do most of the productive work. And the existence of the feudal state, as it were, is to prevent the feudal state from disintegrating, meaning the feudal state of life from disintegrating, which will then prevent the emergence of a new stage in history, in this case, capitalism, where the serfs are allowed to own their own. Now, of course, for Marx, capitalism isn't this freedom that we would believe that it actually represents. It is, in fact, just a way for the bosses to introduce wage slavery as a new form of social control, but that's beside the point, because the capitalist system will then organize a state once it emerges that will then keep that system going. So there will naturally be an affinity, a crony affinity between the government and the business owners, and they will be designed to maintain the current means of production, and in particular to prevent, as Marx would see it, the next revolution, which that next revolution is meant to be socialist. So the emergence of socialism is squashed by the capitalist state, so much so that for Lenin and for Marx and for Marxists ever since, the existence of a capitalist state, let's call it the United States government as an example right now, is for the purpose of stopping a socialist revolution from taking hold of American society. And that's kind of a twisted way to look at the state, but that's the way they see it, because what we have in these feudal or capitalist states is a bourgeois state, one that supports the existing power structure and its power brokers. And its whole point is to defend their ability to maintain their power over the oppressed and to maintain the current state of class antagonisms. So what they argue is that there's this other conception, which is a proletarian state, which has never come into existence yet, or what I should say, that Lenin argues. And of course, I'm kind of just spinning wheels here, but I want to give you enough context because we'll read those sections later. But the proletarian state for Lenin is composed of people who have an awakened socialist consciousness. So they have no desire to maintain class antagonisms. They seek to obliterate class antagonisms. And so the question is, how do you do that? And what happens? And that's where you get to this idea of the economic basis of the withering away of the state. Much of this book is about, well, what happens when the socialists take over? The Bolshevik vanguard party takes over, smashes the existing government structure, seizes power and the means of production, and then you have a new state, right? That's a problem because it's not supposed to. But no, the idea is that it's not a true state. It's only half of a state, a semi-state, according to Lenin, and it's only a semi-state because it has the proletarian ideology of ending the state and ending class altogether, which would also end class antagonism. Of course, that's not what happens in practice, and it becomes a great mystery to these people that their fantasy theory doesn't work, and it just creates the opportunity for endless more theory. So much of this book isn't just about that organization of how do you split the idea of a state into a bourgeois state that maintains class antagonisms and a proletarian state, which will henceforth just be called the state, that will destroy them, and thus that will begin the process of withering the state away. Marx famously had said, this is all based off of Marx's famous remark that in socialism, the state will eventually wither away of its own, giving rise to that transcendent communism that defines his vision, the positive transcendence of private property as human self-estrangement, which allows mankind to return to his true nature as social, which is to say fully human. Okay, so that's Marx's vision. That was a big deal, but they're trying to figure out how to get there, and the state is supposed to wither away, and everybody knows that the state's not going to, especially given that the whole setup for Lenin's idea borrows another idea from Marx and Engels, which is that where they were drawing from the failed Paris Commune as the best attempt at communism up to the time of their death. And what they argued was that you need this object called the dictatorship of the proletariat. You need a proletarian government that understands the idea of getting rid of class antagonism, but that operates not just as a state, but as a totalitarian state in order to make sure everything moves towards socialism, builds socialism, and transforms the people to become socialists. And so how in the hell is that totalitarian thing supposed to wither away? And the answer has always been by having the right religious values and pushing other people to have them. So the belief is, as Stalin put it eventually later, in the 1930s, in 1933, immediately after he killed 9 million, or 3 to 9 million, nobody knows the real number, of Ukrainians in the Holodomor by starving them brutally so that he could prove his power over the kulaks. Stalin said that actually the state will wither away at the zenith of its power, when it reaches its utmost, when it is absolutely and perfectly, completely totalitarian. At that point, the state will begin to wither away because it will no longer be necessary, because it completely transformed or brainwashed everyone still alive, which, spoiler alert, would be basically nobody. And then when it doesn't work, of course, obviously there must be some people who don't believe it right, so you have to do another purge to destroy those people. But I digress about communism in practice. So this chapter is the economic basis of the withering away of the state. So he's laying out the idea that we're going to set up this vanguard party, and the vanguard party is going to be the most advanced theoreticians, and they're going to seize all the power. That's the point of the Bolshevik Revolution, which took place succeeded a couple months after this was written. The so-called October Revolution, which technically, according to our calendar, took place in November, because the calendar hadn't shifted from the old calendar to the new one in Russia yet, and so things were a little bit off. But at any rate, they were about to seize power, and he was thinking about setting up his dictatorship of the proletariat, which is going to be called the Soviet, over the Soviet Union, or the Communist Party, I should say, over the Soviet Union. The Soviet was workers' councils, so they were going to be designated party officials who got to have a vote in their new democratic process, and nobody else did. We call them stakeholders today. Stakeholder councils will vote in place of workers' councils, and the word for workers' councils, or a council of that type in Russia, a deciding council, the type of council that has the power to decide what the people need or the workers need, is called a Soviet, which is where we get that word. So the stakeholder capitalism model that we're dealing with today is not capitalism, and in fact it's a stakeholder Soviet model. It is Sovietism, using the bullshit term stakeholder to replace shareholder in the stock realm. And this was a scheme cooked up by Henry Kissinger and his student Klaus Schwab of the World Economic Forum fame in the late 1960s. But that, again, I digress. Except to mention just, of course, that Klaus has a bust of Lenin on his bookcase for some weird reason. Okay. Long story short, my point was that the vanguard of today's revolution, called the Great Reset, is in fact the stakeholders, which are a Soviet, just like in Soviet Union. Okay, so Marx explains, this is Lenin. You'll hear his tone is different than a lot of the other more religious, visibly, personally religious, I should say, communists that we've read in the past. Marx explains this question most thoroughly, that's the question of the withering away of the state and its economic basis, in his critique of the Gotha program. See, already we're referencing something, right? And so what was the critique of the Gotha program? It's fairly long. Well, Gotha is a region. That's Gotha. I might be mispronouncing it, but I'm guessing. The Gotha program was a kind of incrementalist, moderate socialist program that was being pushed by, if I'm not wrong, the social I'm not totally up on what was going on there historically, so bear with me. But there are two names that are mentioned here down below, and they are, let me make sure I get the guys' first names right. August Babel, or not Babel, Bebel, Bebel, and Ferdinand Lassalle, who were two socialists that are that are contemporaries to Marx in Germany, who are deeply embedded in the Social Democratic Party and its establishment. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, August Bebel was the founder of the Social Democrat Party in Germany. And what was going on is that they had this incrementalist kind of moderate approach to socialism. And so Marx had, of course, write a critique because it's not hard-ass enough. And so the critique of the Gotha program is that him mostly ripping their asses for being too soft, but it also turns out to present the overwhelmingly most comprehensive description Marx ever gave of the concept of the withering away of the state in the process of the development of communism. And I wanted to mention this part only, actually, because I've mentioned the critique of the Gotha program to you before. It shows up in our degrowth podcast, where I went after the Japanese Marxist, the degrowth communist, Kohei Saito. Kohei Saito compares the situation of green growth, or we might even call it the Green New Deal, as compared to degrowth communism being the hard-ass version, as being very similar to the critique of the Gotha program. So green growth, or Green New Deal, the fact that we're going to have a green capitalist economy, in other words, this environmental capitalism that we're kind of being presented with right now, is like the Gotha program. It's a dirty half measure, and Kohei Saito is using degrowth communism as the basis for doing a vicious critique of this half measure, and going to replace it with degrowth communism. And so there's a parallel there, but he also talks a great deal about this long polemic called the Critique of the Gotha Program, which I think was written in 1875, but I'm not 100% sure about that. I might be 100% right, but if I am, it's by at least 10% guessing. So Lenin says about the Critique of the Gotha Program, he says, the polemical part of this remarkable work, which contains a criticism of Lassalleanism, so that's your Ferdinand Lassalle, has, so to speak, overshadowed its positive part, namely the analysis of the connection between the development of communism and the withering away of the state. The reason I wanted to read this chapter to you, by the way, is it's not just about the withering away of the state. Lenin, I should have said this at the beginning, obviously, but what Lenin lays out here is how communism is supposed to develop. And that's what I really wanted to share with you. What I'm calling, and I just called in my workshop in Dallas, Texas, the evolution of communism, or evolution of communism workshop I did in Dallas, Texas, August 9th and 10th. Great success, 100 people there, high energy, everything was fantastic. I hope you guys will all come in if I do another workshop soon, because it was so much fun for everybody. But I characterized Marxism, and particularly I characterized Leninism, I should say, and Stalinism, and the early part of Maoism as a second iteration of communism. I called it Communism 2.0, but I described that as industrial communism, or I use the term interchangeably state communism. And I made a case for each of those terms that I think we're going to hear very clearly by the end of this. So this industrial communism is going to be laid out in this chapter, which is what I call Communism 2.0. Marx is very theoretical communism, where you're just going to kind of go build workers' movements and kind of evangelize to the workers, go among the workers and transform them. It was Communism 1.0. And then we're dealing now with a Communism 3.0 that has left this industrial model behind and has gone corporate. In some sense, it went from the manufacturing side of the business into the marketing side. But that's another story for another podcast. So Section 1, presentation of the question of the withering away of the state, obviously, by Marx. So Lenin setting the table. From a superficial comparison of Marx's letter to Braque of May 5, 1875, with Engels' letter to Bebel of March 28, 1875, which we examined above, meaning in a previous chapter of this book, it might appear that Marx was much more of a champion of the state than Engels, and that the difference of opinion between the two writers on the question of the state was very considerable. So Lenin wants to say, of course, that his two religious prophets did not disagree. Engels suggested to Bebel that all chatter about the state be dropped altogether, that the word state be eliminated from the program, the Gotha program, altogether, and the word community substituted for it. Isn't that an interesting word choice there, community? We're not going to talk about the state. We're going to talk about communities. It's going to be the Gotha community, blah, blah, blah. Engels even declared that the commune was long a state in the proper sense of the word. Yet Marx even spoke of the, quote, future state in communist society, end quote. quote. That is, he would seem to recognize the need for the state even under communism. But such a view would be fundamentally wrong, meaning that there was a distinction between Marx and Engels, not what Marx just said. A closer examination shows that Marx and Engels' view on the state and its withering away were completely identical, and that Marx's expression, quoted above, refers to the state in the process of withering away. So this is a big deal that he makes in the earlier chapters, which maybe I should have set this up, is that the semi-state, the proletarian state, is by its very nature in the process of withering away immediately. But as Engels pointed out, the capitalist state or the feudalist state or the slave state that come before it in earlier stages of history, those do not wither away. Those have to be abolished. So the word trick is that the bourgeois state must be abolished, and after it's abolished, the proletarian state will seize the means of production and will be in control. But that's only half a state because it seeks not to maintain class antagonisms and will therefore wither away. And so the bourgeois state is to be abolished and the proletarian state will wither away. And so what Lenin is saying here is basically this little word trick that they're talking about with the two different types of state is, once you understand that, it resolves their apparent contradiction. Lenin says clearly there can be no question of specifying the moment of the future withering away. The kind of like, with Jesus, no man knows the date or the hour. So there can be no question of specifying the moment of the future withering away, the more so since it will obviously be a lengthy process. The apparent difference between Marx and Engels is due to the fact that they dealt with different subjects and pursued different aims. Engels set out to show Bebel graphically, sharply, and in broad outline the utter absurdity of the current prejudices concerning the state, shared to no small degree by Lassalle. Marx only touched upon this question in passing, being interested in another subject, namely the development of communist society. Let me pause just to make a note of appreciation for you here. Do you notice with me that compared to, say, Marx or Paulo Freire or Herbert Marcuse, that Lenin is abundantly clear in what he's saying? I think part of the reason that I don't think Marx had the capacity to be clear, frankly. But German idealism is what it is. And I know everybody will object. James is wrong. He's not an idealist. No, he was not really a materialist. He was an idealist who channeled his idealism through materialism. There's no question about that. It's just silly to think that he wasn't an idealist because he talked all the time about the concrete nature of reality, because he only talked about it in idealistic terms with a perfectible state and a perfectible person. But when we get to people like Marcuse and Freire and all of these guys later on, I think that they learned their lesson. Lenin was far too clear, and being far too clear leaves you open to exposure. And it certainly would not have flown in the West. They certainly could not have been clear. In fact, Marcuse is so abundantly not clear. Horkheimer actually is, as another critical theorist, is also abundantly not clear. I reread Traditional and Critical Theory the other day, which is almost 80 pages long, and I've struggled to find when the damn thing is going to say anything. It just rambles for, 80 pages. And then Marcuse, on the other hand, almost never clearly says what he's talking about at all. It's always the opposition this, the enemy that. He doesn't tell you who the enemy is. He just says the enemy. The opposition, he says, the need to state a concrete alternative, but he doesn't say what concrete alternative means or concrete alternative to what. It's always extraordinarily difficult and vague to work out what he's talking about, and I believe they did that very much on purpose. But we don't have that with Lenin. Like George Lukács is a very difficult writer, but I think lucid. Lenin is abundantly clear, and as a, I don't think he was a dumb guy, but as in effect a general of some sense of, the Bolshevik army, he's frankly quick and to the point. It's kind of refreshing to read Marxism this way. I don't think he had the sense to know that he needed to hide his intentions, or maybe he just didn't have the pressure to know he needed to hide his intentions. But anyway, I digress. To carry on, he said, this is Lenin again, the whole story of Marx is the application of the theory of development in its most consistent, complete, considered, and pithy form to modern capitalism. Now, I want to pause here. The theory of development. I actually want to make the case that that's the theory of development of everything, including society, man and his soul, and in fact, nature, which all are supposed to come under their worldview. In the workshop I did in Dallas just recently, I made the case, a sustained case through all of the lectures that I gave, no matter which phase of communism I was talking about, that what we're actually dealing with is a transformational or theosophical religion. There are people who are going to, buck at my use of the word theosophical, but I need a word for transformative religion, one where the goal is that you have some vision in your head of what society is supposed to be, and man is supposed to be, and nature is supposed to be, and you are going to force the transformation of those things to that thing. And you don't have to like me calling it theosophy, but that's what theosophy does. You don't have to like me calling it esotericism. You don't have to like me calling it hermeticism. You don't have to like me calling it any of those terms, or occult mysticism, but they all are New Age. They're all the same thing with minor variations, and they all have the same goal, which is the spiritual transformation of man, society, and nature to their completed, perfected state. This is why I say that Marx, despite his material wanderings and presentation, Marx was a friggin' idealist. There was an ideal nature, an ideal man, and an ideal society that were going to be in perfect harmony. You might as well call it the absolute society or the absolute man instead of calling it the absolute idea of Hegel, who was nakedly a German idealist. So it's the same damn theory, just being put through a different lens. But anyway, that's to repeat this first sentence here of this paragraph. The whole theory of Marx, that's what Lenin is saying, is the application of the theory of development, which I'm just going to call social hermeticism or political hermeticism, in its most consistent, complete, considered, and pithy form to modern capitalism. Naturally, Marx was faced with the problem of applying this theory both to the forthcoming collapse of capitalism and to the future development of future communism. The other thing is that Lenin was writing this under some duress, and so it's not very well written. He was writing it hastily under duress, and so you have linguistic quirks like future development of future communism showing up kind of a lot, and we can forgive him for that, I guess. He says, on the basis of what facts, then, can the question of the future development of future communism be dealt with? Well, it wasn't a mistake. He did it on purpose. He did it twice. On the basis of the fact that it has its origin in capitalism, that it develops historically from capitalism, that it is the result of the action of a social force to which capitalism gave birth. That draws off of Marx saying that each society is pregnant with the next. There is no trace of an attempt on Marx's part to make up a utopia. That's actually silly. Only people inside the cult would believe that. A stateless, classless society where everybody has all the plenty that they possibly need and can do whatever they want is certainly a utopia. To indulge in idle guesswork about what cannot be known. Marx definitely indulged in idle guesswork about what cannot be known, because he even does that in the economic philosophic manuscripts, where he does the weird infinite regress progression of man. Man made man. Okay, so who made you? Well, your parents. Well, who made them? Your grandparents. And who made them? And then he says, if you go all the way back, he says, well, stop asking me the question. He says, give up your question and you'll give up your abstraction. So he actually is indulging in idle guesswork about what cannot be known, but he claimed that he had come up with a universal science, Wissenschaftlicher, that was going to determine or to describe how history progresses, and not just progresses like an organic thing that evolves through time, but an organic thing that evolves through time to an intended or teleological or purposed endpoint, which is communism. For Marx, history ends in communism, and it's just a matter of figuring out how to get there. And communists are trying to speed up the eschaton. They're trying to speed up end times so that Eden gets built and we come back to it far sooner. That's what they're trying to do. So this is all, Lenin's just full of shit. He's in the cult. Marx treated the question of communism in the same way as a naturalist would treat the question of the development of, say, a new biological variety, once he knew that it had originated in such and such a way and was changing in such and such definite direction. So that's exactly what I said. And by the way, since I mentioned in my podcast about Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, it turns out that Teilhard is talking about in the chapters 2, 3, and 4 that I'm reading now to organize a podcast, is talking about exactly the same damn thing. And there is the magical part right there, right? First of all, he compares it to evolution, right? But then what does he do? He doesn't just compare it to evolution. He says that such and such that a biological organism has originated in such and such a way and was changing in such and such, not in such and such fashion. That's not what he says. In such and such definite direction. Right? So there is a purpose. And in fact, Teilhard makes the point, not to do this parallel game too much, but they're there, that what happens is everything in the universe, especially man, is evolving toward greater consciousness. And animal evolution on the planet Earth was always evolving toward greater consciousness, which of course is an explicitly religious view. Well, this is actually the same view that Marx has, is that we're evolving toward a greater socialist consciousness. And so actually kind of QED here on what I just said by the rest of this paragraph, which I'd forgotten is what is here. To begin with, Lenin tells us Marx brushed aside the confusion of the Gotha program, brought into the question of the relationship between the state and society. He wrote, and here's a long quote from Marx, and listen to how shockingly convoluted it gets compared to Lenin. Present-day society is capitalist society, which exists in all civilized countries, being more or less free from medieval admixture, more or less modified by the particular historical development of each country, more or less developed. On the other hand, the present-day state changes with a country's frontier. It is different in the Prusso-German Empire from what is in Switzerland, and different in England from what is in the United States. The present-day state is therefore a fiction. Doesn't that sound postmodern? That's not a surprise. Nevertheless, the different states of the different civilized countries, in spite of their motley diversity of form, have all have this in common, that they are based on modern bourgeois society, only one more or less capitalistically developed. They have, therefore, also certain essential characteristics in common. In this sense, it is possible to speak of the present-day state in contrast with the future in which its present root, bourgeois society, will have died off. The question then arises, what transformation will the state undergo in communist society? In other words, what social functions will remain in existence there that are analogous to the present state functions? This question can only be answered scientifically, and one does not get a flea hop nearer to the problem by a 1,000-fold combination of the word people with the word state. So that was Marx, and it's not at all as clear as Lenin, but this is Lenin setting the table, saying, okay, so this is what he sets up. And then this is where he introduces the idea of the withering away. So Lenin goes on, after thus ridiculing all talk about a so-called people's state, Marx formed, so People's Republic of China, right, or the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, Marx formulated the question and gave warning, as it were, that those seeking a scientific answer to it should use only firmly established scientific data. By the way, it's more or less been uncovered that Marx just made up whatever data he used. Most of the time, it wasn't real, so his science is really just ad hoc nonsense to push his wacky religion of transforming the world. Lenin continues, the first fact that has been established most accurately by the whole theory of development, by science as a whole, a fact that was ignored by the utopians and is ignored by the present-day opportunists who are afraid of the social revolution, is that historically there must undoubtedly be a special stage or a special phase of transition from capitalism to communism. And so that's what they're going to discuss. Marx is saying all of the developed or advanced world is in some stage or another of capitalism, but they're not all the same. So we've got to kind of look at this in a very broad generality. And Lenin is saying that there must be a special stage that happens. And so section 2 of this chapter is the transition from capitalism to communism. And Lenin is going to explain how that works. He starts off by quoting Marx. He says, Marx continued, quote, "Between capitalist and communist society lies the period of the revolutionary transformation of the one into the other." That's socialism. Corresponding to this is also a political transition period in which the state can be nothing but the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat. End quote. So that's actually socialism, right? So what's the difference between socialism and communism? High school government 101 that nobody teaches anymore, and I didn't even have. The difference between communism and socialism is that in communism, the commune, everybody, the so-called the people, allegedly own the means of production of all the things. Ownership is communal, at least as an economic system. Whereas in capitalism, ownership is individual. Well, socialism, ownership is in the state. The state owns everything and distributes it socially for people. So technically, socialism is a form of distributism where there is a powerful government that decides who qualifies for what and on what basis and distributes the goods and services and labor of society accordingly. And this special transition period is going to be a dictatorship. The state is going to own and run the means of production of everything, making it socialist, and it is going to do that with the intention of transitioning from capitalism to communism. That's its purpose. In fact, what it does in practice is not that. And the communists will tell you all the time. Real communism has never been tried. It never will be tried either. It can't work. It doesn't work. It's a fiction. It's heaven for a fanatical religion based on the opposite of reality. So it's never going to come into being. So this stage of socialism produces one of two things. One is what we've seen in Soviet Union and what we've seen in especially China after the Great Leap Forward with Mao Zedong, which is unbelievable collapse, just destitution and destruction. And the other is that it generates a reaction that codifies itself in fascism. Marx very famously, I believe in the Critique of the Gotha program also, and referred to communism therefore as the negation of the negation. So the idea is that each stage of history is supposed to negate the previous stage. And so feudal society negates slave society. Capitalism negates the feudal aristocracy by allowing individual ownership. The negation arises from within the thing and its contradictions and then manifests. And then there's supposed to be a synthesis of things for how it really works. But the negation of capitalism would be this socialism, and the negation of socialism would be communism. So the negation of the negation is communism if you're starting from capitalism. But in reality, the negation of capitalism is fascism. You install a threat of a fully tyrannical government or a fully tyrannical government, and the only way out once that gains sufficient power is to establish a totalitarian state that punishes the communists out of society, and you get fascism instead. So jokes on the communists, communism as a religion is the sole force that produces fascism, as we saw in the 20th century at least. You could have other forms of tyrannies that operate in a similar fashion, but the negation of capitalism is, in fact, fascism. And as a matter of fact, even the present circumstance in China testifies to that. The reason that China is wealthy and succeeding, the reason China didn't collapse as a communist country in 1976 when Mao Zedong died, as it should have, because it was so utterly destitute, was because they entered into Deng Xiaoping's new economic model, which was called one country, two systems. Well, what that refers to is a communist government system, that's one of the systems, and a fascist or actually National Socialist production system in terms of its economy. So they were going to have a state-owned land, state-owned resource base, and maybe the heaviest capital would be state-owned, but private interests could run companies to make profit off of them, which is therefore a state-run quasi-capitalist or monopoly capitalist model, aka economically, we're speaking about fascism. And China adopted this deliberately and knowingly to what it is. So yet again, you see that fascism is in fact the negation of the previous stages of history, although technically capitalism never really took off in China. The negation of the negation turns out to be fascism, not communism. You don't ever get to communism, but you frequently get to fascism when you try. So I wish our Marxist friends would drop their fantastical religion and realize that what they're creating is the very thing they think is hell by trying to create their heaven. But I digress. Lenin tells us that Marx bases this conclusion on an analysis of the role played by the proletariat in modern capitalist society, on the data concerning the development of this society, and on the irreconcilability of the antagonistic interests of the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. So I'm glad I explained that to you about the state. Previously, the question was put as follows. To achieve its emancipation, the proletariat must overthrow the bourgeoisie, win political power, and establish its revolutionary dictatorship. Now the question is put somewhat differently. In other words, that didn't work. And so now Lenin, looking at his Bolshevik party and trying to figure out what to do, now the question is put somewhat differently. The transition from capitalist society, which is developing toward communism, to communist society is impossible without a political transition period, and the state in this period can only be the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat. So in other words, by the way, socialism that's headed toward communism as a goal must be a dictatorship that works in the name. Notice I didn't say it's a dictatorship of proletarians. It is a dictatorship that works in the tokenized name of the proletariat. It is a workers' party that may not pay attention to any workers at all. It holds them up as tokens and says what their interests are. It is a stakeholder capitalism that doesn't give a shit what your stake in any of this is. It cares what experts like Bill Gates and John Kerry say your stake should be. See how it works? And the state in this transition period, Lenin is telling us, can only be the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat. Doesn't that feel like the ESG environment or the full blast social credit system that they have in China? How about that? So he says, what then is the relation of this dictatorship to democracy? Because, they've been bandying around the word democracy like that's what they're for, and they're screaming about there's going to be a dictatorship. They've got another square to circle because communists are liars. And so then they boil up a bunch of bullshit fast words and come up with the resolution. So here's where we're going to hear the part that I have presented to you in the past about a word game played on the idea of democracy. But here's what he says. We have seen that the Communist Manifesto simply places side by side the two concepts, quote, to raise the proletariat to the position of the ruling class, and secondly, quote, to win the battle of democracy. Notice that the Communist Manifesto says the point is to win the battle of democracy. Notice that the Democratic Party is saying exactly the same thing right now, and that's why Donald Trump has to be stopped. On the basis of all that has been said above, it is possible to determine more precisely how democracy changes in the transition from capitalism to communism. In a capitalist society, now listen to this, because he gets this right and he gives away the game. In a capitalist society, providing it develops under the most favorable conditions, we have a more or less complete democracy in the Democratic Republic. In other words, the USA, when it's operating like it should, is getting it right. He says, but this democracy is always hemmed in by the narrow limits set by the capitalist exploitation, and consequently always remains in effect a democracy for the minority, only for the propertied classes, only for the rich. Freedom in a capitalist society always remains about the same as it was in the ancient Greek republics, freedom for the slave owners. See what he's done there? Does that ring true? No, but he knows he can agitate that way. Owing to the conditions of capitalist exploitation, the modern wage slaves are so crushed by want and poverty that, quote, they cannot be bothered with democracy, quote, cannot be bothered with politics. In the ordinary peaceful course of events, the majority of the population is debarred from participation in public and political life. Basically, you have to work too hard, which, let me just give a little credit. This was written in 1917. The robber baron thing was still happening. we weren't really out of the woods on very exploitative and cronyistic and monopolistic capitalism, although Teddy Roosevelt had already knocked a hole in some of that for the ones in America. But what he's saying is in this exploitative monopoly capital environment, which they would argue is a necessary later stage of capitalism, that the worker's too busy and exhausted to participate in politics. So the worker doesn't participate in politics, so he has no voice. That's essentially the basis of their argument. The correctness, Lenin tells us, of this statement is perhaps most clearly confirmed by Germany, because constitutional legality steadily endured there for a remarkably long time, nearly half a century, from 1871 till 1914. And during this period, the Social Democrats were able to achieve far more than in other countries in the way of utilizing legality, and organized a larger proportion of the workers into a political party than anywhere else in the world. So he's saying that obviously they had better democracy in Germany, not for this reason or that reason, but because the socialists were more successful at organizing in their circumstances without having to be revolutionary. He says, what was the largest proportion of politically conscious and active wage slaves that has so far been reached in capitalist society? 1 million members of the Social Democratic Party out of 15 million wage workers, 3 million organized in trade unions out of 15 million. I mean, that's not a small proportion, dude. And that's 1 in 5 in the unions. That's 20% of the population. It's not that small. But I want you to focus on the fact that Lenin's party was called the Social Democrat Party, and he's talking about the Social Democrat Party of Germany here. And so the cover right now that the lying Marxist press that we have in the West is covering for, people have noticed, particularly Elon Musk publicly noticed that Kamala Harris is a communist. And she's a communist for sure. And almost all of her rhetoric reflects that. Well, people have noticed, and their claim was that no, in fact, she's not. She's a social democrat. Well, Lenin's party was called the Social Democratic Party. Marx was a little harder than the Social Democrats of Germany, this Bebel and Lassalle. But at any rate, the Social Democrats are basically what Lenin's pointing to and saying those are the people that are on the way to communism. So spare me this nonsense, you lying Marxist press. So here's how Lenin describes the democracy that you get in a capitalist system, especially one in which there is heavy-duty, what he calls wage slavery. Democracy for an insignificant minority, and I've read this quote multiple times. This is the one on Marxist.org that explains democracy. Democracy for an insignificant minority, democracy for the rich. That is the democracy of capitalist society. If we look more closely into the machinery of capitalist democracy, we see everywhere in the petty or supposedly petty details of the suffrage, residential qualifications, exclusion of women, etc., in the technique of the representative institutions, and the actual obstacles to the right of assembly, like public buildings are not for paupers, in the purely capitalist organization of the daily of the daily press, etc., etc. We see restriction after restriction upon democracy. Doesn't that sound like our Democratic Party today? These restrictions, exceptions, exclusions, obstacles for the poor seem slight, especially in the eyes of one who has never known want himself and has never been in close contact with the oppressed classes in their mass life. Doesn't that sound like the Democrats again, even though they're talking about themselves? And 9 out of 10, if not 99 out of 100 bourgeois publicists and politicians come under this category. But in their sum total, these restrictions exclude and squeeze out the poor from politics, from active participation in democracy. They don't so much say the poor, but when the Democrats are out there talking about how black people don't know how to get voter ID cards and they don't know how to use computers and stuff, it prevents them from active participation in democracy. When trans people and gay people have to spend all of their time, and women maybe kind of, but not really, have to spend all of their time just fighting for their basic rights, the bodily autonomy and acceptance. They can't fully participate in democracy. That's called sexual citizenship. It came from Lenin. Marx grasped the essence of capitalist democracy splendidly when, in analyzing the experience of the Commune, meaning I think the Paris Commune, he said that the oppressed are allowed once every few years to decide which particular representatives of the oppressing class shall represent and repress them in Parliament. But from this capitalist democracy, that is inevitably narrow and stealthily pushes aside the poor and is therefore hypocritical and false through and through, forward development does not proceed simply, directly, and smoothly toward greater and greater democracy, as the liberal professors and petty bourgeois opportunists would have us believe. No, the forward development, that is, development toward communism, in case you wonder what progress means, by the way, the forward development, that is, development toward communism, proceeds through the dictatorship of the proletariat and cannot do otherwise, for the resistance of the capitalist exploiters cannot be broken by anyone else or in any other way. Turns out that's actually just not true. The things he just complained about, like the suffrage issues and some of the others, are in some ways legit, and it turns out that literally we were able to achieve reforms. We did not have to have a violent revolution, and we did not have to install a dictatorship of the proletariat to achieve any. He's just wrong. But development toward communism, aka progress, for Lenin proceeds through the dictatorship of the proletariat and cannot do otherwise because capitalists won't let it. And again, he's just wrong. He says, in the dictatorship of the proletariat, which is to say the organization of the vanguard of the oppressed as the ruling class, for the purpose of suppressing the oppressors. That's its whole purpose. Notice it's not for running the government or making things work. It is for suppressing the bourgeoisie. Doesn't that ring true to your experience today? It came from Lenin. Cannot result merely in an expansion of democracy. Simultaneously with an immense expansion of democracy, which for the first time becomes a democracy. This sounds exactly like what Pete Buttigieg said the other day on TV. Simultaneously with an immense expansion of democracy, which for the first time becomes a democracy for the poor, democracy for the people, and not democracy for the money bags, the dictatorship of the proletariat imposes a series of restrictions on the freedom of the oppressors, the exploiters, the capitalists. So they're literally going to become the thing they hate to use it against their class enemies. I think that the excitement they feel is what Kamala Harris calls joy, which I forgot which one of the squad. I can picture her and I can't say her name. Priscilla. I don't remember. The one that nobody's name they can pronounce. The one from Washington. She said it's radical joy. We must suppress them in order to free humanity. We must suppress, this is Lenin saying, we must suppress the bourgeois class in order to free humanity from wage slavery. Their resistance must be crushed by force. It is clear that there is no freedom and no democracy where there is suppression and where there is violence. Notice the irony there. We're going to use force and violence to crush them so there can be freedom and democracy, because there is no freedom and democracy where there is suppression and force. They want to become the thing they hate. In my Gnostic language, they want to become the demiurge so that they can smash or kill the existing demiurge. And then, of course, they're not a demiurge because they have socialist consciousness, which is the true consciousness instead of the false consciousness. So they'll wither away with their demiurgic powers. And that means they're really what I called in our workshop, and I'm still tickled by it, a semi-demiurge. But that's, again, a digression. So now you hear how Lenin was ready to crush his class enemies, and that's the real point of the dictatorship of the proletariat. He then goes on to say Engels expressed this splendidly in his letter to Bebel when he said, as the reader will remember, that, quote, the proletariat needs the state, not in the interests of freedom, but in order to hold down its adversaries. And as soon as it becomes possible to speak of the freedom of the state as such, as soon as it becomes possible to speak of freedom, the state as such ceases to exist, end quote. Okay, so Lenin didn't even come up with this idea of smashing everybody. He got it from Engels, right? And so Marx and Engels, which he said were in perfect harmony on this thought with the dictatorship of the proletariat, said that the purpose of their state is actually to smash their class enemies. It's actually to repress and oppress the bourgeois class, to cut their influence out of society. So you know this is going to be ugly. You know this is going to cause brain drains. You know it's going to destroy everywhere that it goes. And this is what he just said. I mean, Engels said the proletariat needs a state not in the interest of freedom, but in order to hold down its adversaries, right? And so the whole thing is predicated off of a long, all the way back. But think about your life today, right? You had to be forced into taking a vaccine, or actually a gene therapy that you didn't probably want. You were threatened with your career. You've had to keep your mouth shut lest you get cancel cultured out of your job or lose contact with family members. We could go on and on. You're censored on social media vigorously in many cases, especially 2 years ago, under misinformation and disinformation. You're still censored that way on Facebook and Meta products. You see the EU going after Elon Musk for allowing an open-ended conversation to take place with Donald Trump because it might spread harm and racism and so on. It's the exact same model. This is Leninism, but Lenin got it from Engels and Marx. So this is just straight Marxism. But Lenin carries on because he implemented all this stuff very successfully, unfortunately. He says, democracy for the vast majority of the people and suppression by force, that is, exclusion from democracy of the exploiters and oppressors of the people. Doesn't that sound like the word inclusion that we use today? This is the change democracy undergoes during the transition from capitalism to communism. So what is our democracy when it goes through the transition from capitalism to communism? It is democracy for the vast majority of the people, at least in token form, through a stakeholder Soviet, and suppression by force, that is exclusion from democracy of the exploiters and oppressors of the people. So if you're in the oppressor class, right-wingers, for example, conservatives, Christians, straight white men, rich, so on, you are to be silenced. You might be deprived of your property. You are to be censored and even pre-censored. You are to be kept out of the processes of democracy. Obviously, if you're being disenfranchised by whatever's going on in ballot boxes, that would count for that. And that is the change our democracy undergoes during the transition from capitalism to communism. And you wonder why the Democrats say our democracy so much in such a weird way. Only, Lenin tells us, in communist society, only in communist society when the resistance of the capitalists have disappeared, when there are no classes, that is, when there is no distinction between the members of society as regards their relation to the societal means of production, only then the state ceases to exist, and it becomes possible to speak of freedom. Only then will a truly complete democracy become possible and realized, a democracy without any exceptions whatsoever. Now notice Adam Smith would disagree, because Adam Smith has his idea and de Tocqueville really also of democracy in America for him, and for the economy for Adam Smith, was that people of all different levels basically would be mingling and interacting and jockeying for their own interests, and that the magic invisible hand of capitalism, the invisible hand of the market is going to come into being that way, and the magic brew of American democracy was going to come into be that way. No, Lenin says only after you smash all of your class enemies completely and take away their democracy, their access to democracy, will you have a true democracy, right? And only then, he says, will democracy begin to wither away. Owing to the simple fact that, freed from capitalist slavery, from the untold horrors, savagery, absurdities, and infamies of the capitalist exploitation, notice the iron law of projection never misses, right? People will gradually become accustomed to observing the elementary rules of social intercourse that have been known for centuries and repeated for thousands of years in all copybook maxims. Okay, so in other words, after they take over and they crush all of the dissent and nobody can disagree, and the bourgeois class and the other class enemies are smashed, and the only democracy and the only voice and the only messaging is provided by so-called the people, which is validated through the Soviet as representatives of the state, at that point, what's going to happen is that the state and the operation of society will brainwash people by the inversion of praxis into being socialists on their way to communism, and therefore the state is working on its way to wither away. He says they will become accustomed to observing them, meaning those rules, without force, without coercion, without subordination, without special apparatus for coercion called the state. So he has this whole section earlier in the book talking, I think in the first or second chapter, talking about how the state's special role is as a special apparatus for coercion. That's what the state does, is it coerces people into playing along on the given society. So in the socialist, during the transition, in the socialist period, the state is going to be maximally coercive to bend people until they have become accustomed to observing the socialist rules, or as Mao called it, upholding socialist discipline, without force, without coercion, without subordination, without the special apparatus for coercion called the state. And that's why the state will wither away. So Lenin says the expression the state withers away is very well chosen, for it indicates both the gradual and the spontaneous nature of the process. I'm telling you guys, Lenin's fever dream about how communism is supposed to come into being, by the way. Only habit can and undoubtedly will have such an effect, for we see around us on millions of occasions how readily people become accustomed to observing the necessary rules of social intercourse when there is no exploitation, when there is nothing that arouses indignation, evokes protest and revolt, and creates the need for suppression. See, so people can be brainwashed by society to play by all the rules, but only when there's no exploitation or a countervailing ideology brainwashing them to uphold exploitation. And so Lenin tells us in capitalist society we have a democracy that is curtailed, wretched, false, a democracy only for the rich, for the minority. The dictatorship of the proletariat, the period of transition to communism, will for the first time create democracy for the people, right, Pete Buttigieg, for the majority, along with the necessary suppression of the exploiters of the minority. Communism, that means the rich minority, by the way. Communism alone is capable of providing really complete democracy. And the more complete it is, the sooner it will become unnecessary and wither away of its own accord. That's why Stalin said that the only way to get it to wither away would have the dictatorship reach the utmost of its power. That you have to have more and more and more totalitarianism in order to get away from totalitarianism or state control at all. Because the more complete communism is, or the more complete democracy is, the sooner it will become unnecessary and wither away of its own accord, which only takes place under communism. Communism alone is capable of providing really complete democracy. So he says, in other words, under capitalism, we have the state in the proper sense of the word, that is a special machine for the suppression of one class by another, and what is more, of the majority by the minority, meaning the rich are suppressing the poor. Naturally, to be successful, such an undertaking as the systematic suppression of the exploited majority by the exploiting minority calls for the utmost ferocity and savagery in the matter of suppressing. It calls for seas of blood through which mankind is actually wading its way in slavery, serfdom, and wage labor. So iron law of woke projection never misses. That's what they're going to visit upon their class enemies. Seas of blood through which mankind is wading in its attempt to bring about communism. Furthermore, during the transition from capitalism to communism, suppression is still necessary, but now it is the suppression of the exploiting minority by the exploited majority. A special apparatus, a special machine for suppression, the state, is still necessary, but this is now a transitional state. Like I said earlier, he called it a semi-state. It is no longer a state in the proper sense of the word, for the suppression of the minority of exploiters by the majority of wage slaves of yesterday is comparatively so easy, simple, and natural a task that it will entail far less bloodshed than the suppression of the risings of the slaves, serfs, or wage laborers, and it will cost mankind far less. How wrong was he? How wrong was he? Oh, the tragedy. How wrong was he? And it is compatible with the extension of democracy to such an overwhelming majority of the population that the need for a special machine of suppression will begin to disappear. That's exactly the opposite of what happened. Because it doesn't work, it just required more and more and more totalitarianism. The same experiment was done in China, and it just required more and more and more totalitarianism until the whole thing broke. Actually, in China twice. Naturally, the exploiters are unable to suppress the people without a highly complex machine for performing this task, but the people can suppress the exploiters even with a very simple, quote, machine, almost without a quote machine, without a special apparatus, by the simple organization of the armed poor, such as the Soviets of workers and soldiers' deputies, we would remark, running ahead. Lastly, only communism makes the state absolutely unnecessary, for there is nobody to be suppressed. Nobody in the sense of a class, of a systematic struggle against a definite section of the population. See, I'm glad I told you how he redefines state. We are not utopians. Yes, you are. We are not utopians, he says, and do not in the least deny the possibility and inevitability of excesses on the part of individual persons or the need to stop such excesses. No, the whole party goes in excess, actually, but this allows you to blame them and do purges. In the first place, however, no special machine, no special apparatus of suppression is needed for this. This will be done by the armed people themselves as simply and as readily as any crowd of civilized people, even in modern society, interferes to put a stop to a scuffle or to prevent a woman from being assaulted. Not under communist rules. Look at our cities and look at yours. And as a matter of fact, let's talk about this armed population, right? Who gets armed? People who agree with the party. Everybody else got disarmed, right? Why? Because they were class enemies. They had the wrong views. So you have to arm only the communists and everybody else isn't allowed to be armed. That's the program. He says, and secondly, we know that the fundamental social cause of excesses, which consist in the violation of the rules of social intercourse, is the exploitation of the people, their want, and their poverty. Once again, the iron law of Vogue projection never misses. With the removal of this chief cause, excesses will inevitably begin to wither away. We do not know how quickly and in what succession, but we do know they will wither away. With their withering away, the state will also wither away. Without building utopias, Marx defined more fully what can be defined now regarding this future, namely the differences between the lower and higher phases, or levels, or stages of communist society. Section 3, the first phase of communist society. In the critique of the Gotha program, Marx goes into detail to disprove Lassalle's idea that under socialism the worker will receive the undiminished or full product of his labor. Marx shows that from the whole of the social labor of society there must be deducted a reserve fund, a fund for the expansion of production, a fund for the replacement of the wear and tear of machinery, and so on. Oh, so they go along and promise that they're going to get, if you work for it, it's yours. And then they say, except for all the stuff we have to reserve for the management and operation of the whole program, which is exactly the same program that they're in. But now they have people with no profit motive, only a theft motive, stepping into that role. What a shock that the iron law of corruption destroys the whole thing and makes everybody poorer and worse off. Plus, it's idiots that don't know how to run it because with lacking a profit motive, it didn't select for expertise or merit. It selected for party loyalty and being an obedient party. I was going to say some bad words there. Then, Lenin tells us, from the means of consumption must be deducted a fund for administrative expenses, for schools, for hospitals, old people's homes, and so on. So the state is just going to keep taking higher and higher taxes, and they're going to take a portion just like the owners did, only with no profit motive to try to limit those expenses. But Marx knew it all, even though he never had a job. Instead of Lassalle's hazy, obscure general phrase, quote, the full product of his labor to the worker, Marx makes a sober estimate of exactly how socialist society will have to manage its affairs. Marx proceeds to make a concrete analysis of the conditions of life of a society in which there will be no capitalism, and he says, quote, what we have to deal with here in analyzing the programs of the Workers' Party is a communist society, not as it has developed on its own foundations, but on the contrary, just as it emerges from capitalist society, which is thus in every respect economically, morally, and intellectually still stamped with the birthmarks of the old society from whose womb it comes, end quote. So this new thing is going to work an awful lot like the old thing, is what Marx is saying. It's not communism yet. It's just been born and it carries the birthmarks of capitalism. So it's going to have all the exploitation coming along with. Herbert Marcuse in One-Dimensional Man blames this on technological rationality, right? He says that the socialists come along and they seize the means of production, but that means they seize a bunch of capitalist factories and trucks and stuff. And so the technological rationality, what is the truck for? What is the factory for? Well, production and distribution and all the things capitalist society focuses on. And So it just reproduces capitalism because of technological rationality. So we need a new technology that's designed for socialism. But we're not talking about Marcuse today, just to tell you what he says. It actually just came from Marx too. These people are not original. They just repackaged the old stuff over and over again. And I'm not positive where Marx got a lot of it, but he wrote an absurd amount of crap. Maybe he got it from Satan. I don't know. So Lenin tells us it is this communist society which has just emerged into the light of day out of the womb of capitalism and which is in every respect stamped with the birthmarks of the old society that Marx terms the first or lower phase of communist society. So that's the socialist part, right, where it's brutal and awful and seas of blood. The means of production are no longer the private property of individuals, Lenin explains. The means of production belong to the whole of society. Of course, that's authenticated through this dictatorship of the proletariat acting as the state. Every member of society performing a certain part of the socially necessary work, that means they're all going to be slaves, receives a certificate from the society to the effect that he has done a certain amount of work, and with this certificate he receives from the public store of consumer goods a corresponding quantity of products. After a deduction is made for the amount of labor which goes to the public fund, every worker therefore receives from society as much as he has given to it. Now hold on. The only difference from capitalism here, literally it's like you go to work and they give you certificates, aka money, and then you can go to the store and buy your goods with your money, but there will be a deduction made called taxes from what you earned that goes to the public fund. And you receive in proportion to how much you've given it. The only difference between capitalism is that this is measured against a certain amount of work, not against a production of value. Do you see why that falls apart? Everybody who does work, like you could literally be hitting the ground with a hammer and achieving nothing, breaking rocks for no reason. You're doing work. You could carry rocks from one end of the yard, and then when you get them all over there, you could pick them up and carry them back to the other end of the yard. You did work all day, and you produced literally no value. And according to that, you've done a certain amount of work, so you receive a certificate, and you can go buy things with it after they take your taxes out. It's exactly the same process, except now, instead of focusing on doing something productive that provides value to other human beings, which is what capitalism enables, instead of that, it's all adjudicated based on how much work you did. Isn't that fantastic, right? And if they were actually going to measure how much work you did in terms of, say, how many carts of coal you loaded up, they're doing exactly the same that capitalists are doing, except now you have party hacks and morons running the show, and tons of waste and tons of opportunity for grift that went away, and lots of robbery. And so Lenin describes this circumstance as equality apparently reigns supreme. This is an early communism, aka socialism. He says, but when Lassalle, having in view such a social order, usually called socialism, but termed by Marx the first phase of communism, when he says that this is, quote, equitable distribution, what a funny word there, that this is, quote, the equal right of all to an equal product of labor, end quote, Lassalle is mistaken, and Marx exposes the mistake. Hence, the equal right, says Marx, in this case still Hence, the equal right, says Marx, in this case still certainly conforms to, quote, bourgeois law, like I just told you, which, like all law, implies inequality. All law is an application of an equal measure to different people who are in fact not alike, are not equal to one another. That's why the so-called equal right is a violation of equality and an injustice. In fact, everyone having performed as much social labor as another receives an equal share of the social product after the above-mentioned deductions. But people are not alike. One is strong, another is weak. One is married, another is not. One has more children, another less, and so on. And the conclusion Marx draws is, quote, with an equal performance of labor and hence an equal share in the social consumption fund, one will in fact receive more than another, one will be richer than another, and so on. To avoid all these defects, the right, instead of being equal, would have to be unequal, end quote. So what Lenin says then is that the first phase of communism, therefore, cannot yet provide justice and equality. Listen to these words: equity, justice, equality. Differences and unjust differences in wealth will still persist, but the exploitation of man by man will have become impossible because it will be impossible to seize the means of production, the factories, machines, land, etc., and to make them private property. See, it's only exploiting you if it's private interests exploiting you. It's not exploiting you if it's a socialist government doing it on your behalf. That is literally the logic here. The exploitation of man by man is gone because it's a socialist state that has the right intentions of getting rid of exploitation. So Lenin continues in smashing Lassalle's petty bourgeois vague phrases about equality and justice in general. Marx shows the course of development of communist society, which is compelled to abolish at first only the injustice of the means of production seized by individuals, and which is unable at once to eliminate the other injustice, which consists in the distribution of consumer goods, quote, according to the amount of labor performed, and not according to needs. So there's the shift. Now let me remind you, just because this is so fitting at the moment of what we've just gone through, that Kohei Saito, the degrowth communism Japanese Marxist guy, said that the degrowth communist program is like the critique of the Gotha program against, say, the Green New Deal or green growth, right? Green capitalism. So green capitalism or the Green New Deal is, in parallel, the socialist part on the way to the degrowth communism that is the real goal. And Kohei Saito is coming along to make sure that the people that are running the program know you're not going to get to make a profit off of this, or not for long. That might be a thing at first, but you have it all wrong. And this is exactly the explanation for why. Just to remind you that we're living through the same story now. The vulgar economists, according to Lenin, include the bourgeois professors and our Tugend, I did not look up who that is, consistently reproach. So Lenin, like almost everybody else in this, are constantly throwing barbs at their political enemies. The vulgar economists, including the bourgeois professors, consistently reproach the socialists with forgetting the inequality of people and with dreaming of eliminating this inequality. Such a reproach, as we see, only proves the extreme ignorance of the bourgeois ideologists. Marx not only most scrupulously takes account of the inevitable inequality of men, but he also takes into account the fact that the mere conversion of the means of production into the common property of the whole society, commonly called socialism, does not remove the defects of distribution and the inequality of bourgeois laws, which continues to prevail so long as the products are divided according to the amount of labor performed. Continuing, Marx says, quote, but these defects are inevitable in the first phase of communist society as it is I've got my inflection wrong. But these defects are as inevitable in the first phase of communist society as it is when it has just emerged, after prolonged birth pangs from capitalist society. Law can never be higher than the economic structure of society and its cultural development conditioned thereby. So that's Marx. And Lenin replies, and so in the first phase of communist society, usually called socialism, bourgeois law is not abolished in its entirety, but only in part, only in proportion to the economic revolution so far attained. That is, only in respect of the means of production. Bourgeois law recognizes them as the private property of individuals. Socialism converts them into common property. To that extent, and to that extent alone, bourgeois law disappears. However, it persists as far as its other part is concerned. It persists in the capacity of the regulator, determining factor, in parentheses, in the distribution of products and allotment of labor among the members of society. The socialist principle, he who does not work shall not eat, is already realized. The other socialist principle, an equal amount of products for an equal amount of labor, is also already realized. But this is not yet communism, and it does not yet abolish bourgeois law, which gives unequal individuals in return for really unequal amounts of labor, equal amounts of products. So their beef with capitalism is that some people, at least in their minds, work less and therefore don't deserve getting more, right? And that is going to be absolutely abolished. But in this first phase of communism, aka socialism, most of the principles are still there. Like I said, this is a shift from being rewarded for how much value you produce to being rewarded for how much labor you did, right? There's the shift, which means lots of pointless things start getting rewarded. And the party has the absolute power. The workers' councils, the Soviet, has absolute power to decide what counts as labor and for who. This is a defect, says Marx, but it's unavoidable in the first phase of communism. For if we are not to indulge in utopianism, we must not think that having overthrown capitalism, people will at once learn to work for society without any rules of law. Besides, the abolition of capitalism does not immediately create the economic prerequisites for such a change. Now, there are no other rules than those of bourgeois law. To this extent, therefore, there still remains the need for a state, which, while safeguarding the common ownership of the means of production, would safeguard equality in labor and in the distribution of products. In other words, it would enforce equity. The state withers away insofar as there are no longer any capitalists, any classes, and consequently no class can be suppressed. So how does the state really wither away? By getting rid of the capitalists, which means brainwashing them, right, aka transforming them or ideologically molding them, or killing them. Lenin concludes the section by saying, but the state has not yet completely withered away, since the still remains the safeguarding of bourgeois law, which sanctifies actual inequality. For the state to wither away completely, complete communism is necessary. 4. The higher phase of communist society. Marx continues. In a higher phase of communist society, after the enslaving subordination of the individual to... So, by the way, this is the paragraph that... this is the most famous part of Critique of the Gotha program, which everybody's heard. So Marx continues, talking about the higher phase of communist society, says, in a higher phase of communist society, after the enslaving subordination of the individual to the division of labor, and with it also the antithesis between mental and physical labor has vanished, after labor has become not only a livelihood, but life's prime want, after the productive forces have increased with all-round development of the individual. Notice labor is supposed to become life's prime want, right? You're supposed to just want to work for society because you've been transformed to be a religious zealot for the commune. After the productive forces have increased with all-round development of the individual, meaning you're going to become a Superman, so you're going to produce more because you're working so enthusiastically and effectively, and you're now a communist Superman for society, and all the springs of cooperative wealth flow more abundantly. Only then can the narrow horizon of bourgeois law be left behind in its entirety, and society inscribe on its banners, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. And that's the most famous part of Marx's expression of communism. Only now, Lenin tells us, can we fully appreciate the correctness of Engels' remarks, mercilessly ridiculing the absurdity of combining the words freedom and state. So long as the state exists, there is no freedom. When there is freedom, there will be no state. Does that sound like delusional woke people to you? And so what does that mean? Well, they're going to establish this semi-state. There's going to be a lot of states. So they're going to, Iron Law of Woke Projection tells us, they're going to apply a lot of no freedom, right? So the economic basis, he says, for the complete withering away of the state is such a high state of development of communism at which the antithesis between mental and physical labor disappears. He's just repeating Marx there. At which there consequently disappears one of the principal sources of modern social inequality, the source, moreover, which cannot on any account be removed immediately by the mere conversion of the means of production into public property or the mere expropriation of the capitalist. So people doing the mental work, thinking it up, what the company's going to do and all that, those people should not be getting more reward than the workers. There will be no difference between mental and physical work whatsoever. He says this expropriation will make it possible for the productive forces to develop to a tremendous extent. Apparently not, but okay. That's the 2 + 2 = 5 thing from Soviet Union, by the way. 2 + 2 = 5 meant 2 years plus 2 years plus the enthusiasm of the transformed worker will create 5 years worth of work. That's literally what the poster set actually indicates. And when we see how incredibly capitalism is already retarding this development, when we see how much progress could be achieved on the basis of the level of the technique already attained, we are entitled to say with the fullest confidence that the expropriation of the capitalists will inevitably result in an enormous development of the productive forces of human society. Turns out that's not what really happens, but they have a lot of ability to force people to do things, in a command economy, as it's called. But how rapidly this development will proceed, how soon it will reach the point of breaking away from the division of labor, of doing away with the antithesis between mental and physical labor, of transforming labor into, quote, life's prime want. Just imagine that. We do not and cannot know. Now let me talk about this, just riff on that for a second. Labor is supposed to be transformed into life's prime want, but all the Marxists, whether it's Kohei Saito, whether it's Herbert Marcuse, whether it's Marx, it doesn't matter. We could pick any of them. All they're really after is literally, and I quote, the reduction of the working day. So labor is supposed to be life's prime want, but the goal is that you don't have to labor. Like, these people talk about contradictions in capitalism and are really, really, really funny in doing so. If you haven't figured out yet that Marxism is an entitlement complex posing as a religion, it's probably time to do so. The primary motivation is a reduction of the working day and to still be paid equally for it. Not even equally, actually. You're supposed to be paid according to your need, which for Marx might have been a lot because he was like this big drunkard and had all these problems and stuff. So Lenin goes on, he says, that is why we are entitled to speak only of the inevitable, withering away of the state, emphasizing the protracted nature of this process and its dependence upon the rapidity of development of the higher phase of communism, and leaving the question of the time required for or concrete forms of the withering away quite open, because there is no material for answering these questions. In other words, just like with Jesus coming back, nobody knows the day or hour. We don't know when the state's going to wither away. I keep trying to tell people that communism is, in fact, and that, by the way, is an eschatological moment in Christianity when Jesus is supposed to come back. That's an eschatological moment. The withering away of the state is the eschatological moment of communism. That's when this enforced, brutal socialism suddenly sacrifices itself like Christ to liberate all of mankind from the sin, the original sin of the belief in individuality and private property. Isn't that amazing that it's literally the same damn thing but turned inside out and turned evil? But they have no material to answer the question of when or how that's actually going to happen. The state, he says, will be able to wither away completely when society adopts the rule from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. That is, when people have become so accustomed, brainwashed into, observing the fundamental rules of social intercourse, socialist discipline, maintaining socialist discipline, and when their labor has become so productive that they will voluntarily work according to their ability. Yeah. The narrow horizon of bourgeois law, which compels one to calculate with the heartlessness of a Shylock whether one has not, that of course refers to the Merchant of Venice, right? Whether one has not worked half an hour more than anybody else, this narrow horizon will then be left behind. There will then be no need for society in distributing the products to regulate the quantity to be received by each. Each will take freely according to his needs. See, you have to get the production standards up super high so that there's ample excess. There's so much extra that people can take whatever they want. Of course, they did this experiment actually in China where they were actually failing their production quotas, but because of the communist thing during the Great Leap Forward in the grain production in the late 1950s and early, maybe 1960, they were bragging 58, 59, 60, how much excess grain they were producing. But the fact of the matter was they weren't producing it at all. They were faking it because the production standards were being brought down from Beijing and were impossible. So everybody was just like in this increasing the targets mania, everybody was increasing. Oh yeah, well, we could grow, say 5 tons of grain in our field. Yeah, well, actually, let's revise it up to 7. Let's make it 10. Why not round it off to 20? I bet we could get 40. And then, of course, they produce like 3, and they come up with all these ways to fudge the books. But the party, at least to some degree, believed, at least for a time, in excess grain production and plenty, and put out a campaign which was eat your fill. take as many bowls of rice as you want. They were wasting rice and other grains. They were dumping them in the sewer. They were just literally just wasting them. And literally at the same time, they were missing their production, their basic bare minimum production quotas by, possibly 2/3. They were only producing about 1/3 as much food as they actually needed to run the country. And so guess what happened? They ate all their stores in this kind of weird gluttony, trying to prove that they could take accordingly and freely to their needs, which weren't people's needs. People didn't need to eat 2 or 3 kilos of rice a day, but they were doing it, and whatever else, because they could, and they would have been hungry, and they didn't know when they'd get to eat again. It turns out the whole thing just doesn't work, just to kind of abbreviate a long story. From the bourgeois point of view, Lenin tells us it's easy to declare that such a social order is sheer utopia, and to sneer at the socialists for promising everyone the right to receive from society without any control over the labor of the individual citizen, any quantity of truffles, cars, pianos, etc. Even to this day, most bourgeois savants confine themselves to sneering in this way. Yeah, they should really, thereby betraying both their ignorance and their selfish defense of capitalism. Ignorance, for it has never entered the head of any socialist to promise that the higher phase of development of communism will arrive. As for the greatest socialists' forecast that it will arrive, it presupposes not the present ordinary run of people who, like the seminary students in Pomilovsky's stories, are capable of damaging the stocks of public wealth just for fun and of demanding the impossible. Until the higher phase of communism arrives, the socialists demand the strictest control by society and the state over the measure of labor and the measure of consumption. But this control must start with the expropriation of the capitalists, with the establishment of the workers' control over the capitalists, as are our stakeholder Soviets, by the way, and must be exercised not by a state of bureaucrats, but by a state of armed workers. In other words, a secret police. Now, what he actually is suggesting here is that people will not have transformed, so we're not going to be able to have that, right? People will not take according to their need. They'll take recklessly. And there can be no promise of just doling things out and letting people work according to their ability to contribute, because people haven't been fundamentally transformed. As Marcuse phrases it, that qualitative difference has not occurred. The qualitative change in people, the biological foundation for socialism, he called it, has not occurred. It says the selfish defense of capitalism by the bourgeois ideologists and their hangers-on, and he lists some of his enemies there, consists in that they substitute arguing and talk about the distant future for the vital and burning question of present day politics, namely the expropriation of the capitalists. I laugh because it's all he keeps coming back to is we're going to smash class enemies. That's really what this is about. The conversion of all citizens into workers, that means actually enlightened people. It means awakening their consciousness, right? And other employees of one huge syndicate. But I'm going to read that again, and I'm going to read it literally this time, right? The vital and burning question of present-day politics is, namely, the expropriation of the capitalists and the conversion of all citizens into workers and other employees of one huge syndicate, the whole state. So the whole state's going to be one huge syndicate, or, multi-pronged corporation, and the complete subordination of the entire work of this syndicate to a genuinely democratic state, the state of the Soviets of workers and soldiers' deputies. So a Soviet model is going to run that, which is that the enlightened or sufficiently loyal and fervent workers will be the people who make all the decisions. He says, in fact, when a learned professor, followed by the Philistine, followed in turn by the his enemies, the Tellys, Tseretely's and Chernovs, talk of wild utopias. I guess those are utopian socialists. Of the demagogic promises of the Bolsheviks, or the impossibility of introducing socialism it is the higher stage or phase of communism he has in mind, which no one has ever promised or even thought to introduce, because generally speaking it cannot be introduced. So Lenin's saying criticisms of this communist program is total bullshit, because you criticize it against real communism, which hasn't been tried and in fact can't even be introduced. You can't even try it yet. You can't try real communism. You have to try administered communism first, aka socialism. Then it might wither away to communism. So nobody, he said, your criticism's bunk. You're fighting a straw man. The socialists are not actually promising the moon. They're not promising all this great stuff, which is literally their sales pitch, which is what most of the young people supporting them think they're promising. What they're promising, in fact, is a totalitarian administered system of hard labor and redistribution until maybe things work out well enough for the higher phase to develop after everybody has been ideologically remolded, aka brainwashed into being communist, so that they will voluntarily make their life's purpose be to work for the state, but not for themselves. And they will be so productive. This is Lenin develops this into what's called his theory of productive forces, that productive forces have to be developed constantly and at the fastest rate possible, which caused both Soviet Union and China, PRC, the People's Republic of China, to face gigantic tragedies of mass death. That when you can only have this when there's enough voluntary, overwhelmingly surplus producing production that you can actually take according to your needs. And if this starts to sound, and notice how many times they tell you this isn't utopian, right? But if they brainwash people and give them enough socialist enthusiasm, they think it will come about. It's all about the transformation of the individual into socialist or Soviet man who can do this. And that character doesn't exist. I don't know that it's got Nietzsche's Superman written all over it, Ubermensch written all over it, but there's a little bit of that flavor, isn't there? I mean, that's certainly the model and the motif for the fascists, but I don't know if it inspired people like Lenin. So Lenin carries on, and this isn't much longer. And this brings us to the question of the scientific distinction. We're getting to the kind of the punchline that made me was like, damn, I've got to read this to people. And this brings us to the question of the scientific distinction between socialism and communism, which Engels touched on in his above quoted argument about the incorrectness of the name Social Democrat. Politically, the distinction between the first or lower and the higher phase of communism will in time probably be tremendous. Probably. But it would be ridiculous to recognize this distinction now under capitalism, and only individual anarchists perhaps could invest it with primary importance. If, he says, there are still people among the anarchists who have learned nothing from the Plekhanov conversion of the Kropotkins, I'm sorry, Russian is a language that I can't even look at right yet, of Grave, Cornelissen, and other stars of anarchism into social chauvinists or anarcho-trenchists as Gay, I guess, one of the few anarchists who still have preserved a sense of humor and conscience, has put it. So it's, again, just more jabs at his enemies. This isn't the point. But the scientific distinction between socialism and communism is clear. So he says that the material difference will probably be big in the future, but not so much at first. But the scientific distinction between socialism and communism is clear, he says. What is usually called socialism was termed by Marx the first or lower phase of communist society. Insofar as the means of production become common property, the word communism is also applicable here, providing that we do not forget that this is not complete communism. The great significance of Marx's explanations is that here, too, he consistently applies materialist dialectics, the theory of development, which I'm telling you is this, just consider that social hermeticism of transformation, and regards communism as something which develops out of capitalism. Instead of scholastically invented, concocted definitions and fruitless disputes over words, what is socialism? What is communism? Marx gives an analysis of what might be called the stages of economic... Sorry, I got excited. I thought we were doing a Kamala Harris. I get so excited. It's not. Marx gives an analysis of what might be called the stages of the economic maturity of communism. This is sometimes in their literature now called stagism, and it is a complex debate in Marxist thought as to whether stagism, first stage, second stage, and so on, for communism is correct, or if, in fact, that socialism is something fundamentally distinct, or if and not a phase of communism or early stage of communism, or if this model is completely incorrect and we basically have a communist eschaton right out of nowhere. In its first phase, or first stage, communism, Lenin tells us, cannot yet be fully mature economically and entirely free from traditions or vestiges of capitalism. Those things have to be stamped out first. Remember, Lenin's point is that the first and most important thing that the program is supposed to do is destroy class enemies, but also traditions, therefore smashing the four olds in China, right? The old society has to be smashed out completely and destroyed for the new society. Old culture, old religion, old belief, all has to be shattered to bring in new communist or socialist culture. Lenin says, hence, the interesting phenomenon that communism in its first phase retains the narrow horizon of bourgeois law. Of course, bourgeois law in regard to the distribution of consumer goods inevitably presupposes the existence of the bourgeois state, for law is nothing without an apparatus capable of enforcing the observance of the rules of law. It follows that under communism, there remains for a time not only bourgeois law, but even the bourgeois state without the bourgeoisie. That justifies their brutality, I suppose. This may sound like a paradox, he says. No, it's just straight up bullshit squaring a circle, Lenin. This may sound like a paradox or simply a dialectical conundrum of which Marxism is often accused by people who have not taken the slightest trouble to study its extraordinarily profound content. So that's me, like I just said, because I just trashed it, right? So I didn't take in the slightest trouble to study its extraordinarily profound content. I just didn't understand. It's a Gnostic thing. You wouldn't get it. But in fact, Lenin tells us, remnants of the old surviving in the new confront us in life at every step. See, the old always survives in the new. Everything comes in waves and stages and everything else, both in nature and in society, he tells us. And Marx did not arbitrarily insert a scrap of bourgeois law into communism, but indicated what is economically and politically inevitable in a society emerging out of the womb of capitalism. He says, democracy means equality. The greatest significance of the proletariat's struggle for equality and of equality as a slogan will be clear if we correctly interpret it as meaning the abolition of classes. But democracy means only formal equality, and as soon as equality is achieved for all members of society in relation to ownership of the means of production, that is, equality of labor and wages, humanity will inevitably be confronted with the question of advancing further from formal equality to actual equality. By the way, in Russian, actual equality is the thing that we consider equity today. That is, as Lenin puts it, to the operation of the rule, quote, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. So what does equity mean? Actual equality. What is actual equality? It's equality extended not just to the economic sphere, but also to the rest of the spheres of life that will allow the operation of the rule from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. In other words, equity came from Lenin, where he got it from Marx and Engels. It's Marxism. So when you have Kamala Harris promoting equity, you know what she's promoting, along with the rest of our society, which better wake your ass up and tell you you're in the middle of a communist revolution and that we have to stop it before we lose our freedom forever, and your children's freedom and your children's children and so on. Lenin says, by what stages, by means of what practical measures humanity will proceed to this supreme aim, which is actual equality, right? Communism. Equity, he says, we do not and cannot know, but it is important to realize how infinitely mendacious, full of lies, how infinitely mendacious is the ordinary bourgeois conception of socialism as something lifeless, rigid, fixed once and for all, whereas in reality, only socialism will be the beginning of a rapid, genuine, truly mass-forward movement, embracing first the majority and then the whole of the population in all spheres of public and private life. Democracy, he says, our democracy apparently, is of enormous importance to the working class in its struggle against the capitalists for its emancipation, but democracy is by no means a boundary not to be overstepped. So it's not, if you have to cheat in an election, you have to cheat in an election. It is only one of the stages on the road from feudalism to capitalism and from capitalism to communism. Democracy is a form of the state. It represents, on the one hand, the organized, systematic use of force against persons, but on the other, it signifies the formal recognition of the equality of citizens, the equal right of all to determine the structure of and to administer the state. This, in turn, notice that that's the opposite of American liberalism, right? Let's be very clear. We do not, in the United States, we're all created equal, right? That's what our Declaration of Independence says. We do not have an equal right to determine the structure of and to administer the state. We have an equal right to be left alone by the administration of the state. That's an important distinction. We're not trying to administer over other people. We're trying to prevent and use the government to prevent the administering of other people over us. That's a complete turning on its head. So when people tell you that this came out of liberalism, they don't understand at least American liberalism. Lenin says this in turn results in the fact that at a certain stage in the development of democracy, it first welds together the class that wages a revolutionary struggle against capitalism, the proletariat, and enables it to crush, to smash to atoms, to wipe off the face of the earth, the bourgeois, even the Republican bourgeois state machine, the standing army, the police, and the bureaucracy, and to substitute for them a more democratic state machine. Doesn't that sound exactly like the Democratic Party for the last 6 years, 8 years? But a state machine, nevertheless, in the shape of armed workers who proceed to form a militia involving the entire population. So that's his vision, right? That's so much like 2020 is just written all over this. Okay, so let's see. First, it welds together the class that wages a revolutionary struggle against capitalism. So that's the people that went berserk all through 2020. They're the proletariat, and it enables them to crush, smash to atoms, wipe off the face of the earth, the bourgeois, even the Republican bourgeois. And the standing army, the state machine has to be either captured or wiped away. The standing army, defund the police. Yeah, there it is. Here, Lenin tells us, quantity turns into quality. See, it's not about having enough stuff. It's about having a socialist view and the high quality understanding of what you do have. Here, quantity turns into quality. Such a degree, and Marcuse talks about this all the time, right? He says that by maintaining the technological rationality of capitalism moving into socialism, that all we do is go from quantity to quantity, right? The Soviet Union, he says, in fact, was just a matter of quantities and increasing production, so more quantities. It never transformed in quality. It never had that qualitative change, that transformation, that positive transcendence, as Marx put it, of private property as human self-estrangement, to be reborn as a new man. But Lenin says otherwise. Here is where quantity turns into quality. Such a degree of democracy implies overstepping the boundaries of bourgeois society and beginning its socialist reorganization. Oh, you have to overstep the boundaries of society. You have to be radicals. You have to start to destroy things. If really all take part in the administration of the state, capitalism cannot retain its hold. The development of capitalism in turn creates the preconditions that enable really all. Notice how it's always going to be education for all, opportunities for all, and so on. The development of capitalism in turn creates the preconditions that enable really, quote, all to participate, to take part in the administration of the state. Some of these preconditions are universal literacy, which has already been achieved in a number of the most advanced capitalist countries, then the training and disciplining of millions of workers by the huge, complex, socialized apparatus of the postal service, railways, big factories, large-scale commerce, banking, etc., etc. Given these economic preconditions, Lenin tells us it is quite possible, after the overthrow of the capitalists and the bureaucrats, to proceed immediately, overnight, to replace them in the control over production and distribution, in the work of keeping account of labor and products by the armed workers, by the whole of the armed population. Who's going to be armed? The socialists. Everybody else will be disarmed. The question of control and accounting should not be confused with the question of scientifically trained staffs of engineers, agronomists, and so on. These gentlemen are working today in obedience to the wishes of the capitalists and will work even better tomorrow in obedience to the wishes of the armed workers. You think that's actually true? Would you work better under the gun of the Soviet? Well, Who is he referring to? They work well today, the agronomists, but they'll work even better with socialist stuff, right? Like Trofim Lysenko, who came up with socialist agriculture and agronomy in order to displace bourgeois science and starved millions and millions and millions of people because Stalin backed it and made sure that was going to be implemented everywhere. Accounting and control, Lenin says, that is mainly what is needed for the smooth working, for the proper functioning, for the first phase of communist society. Accounting and control. Think about it. All citizens are transformed into, this is the key paragraph or set of paragraphs. All citizens, that's in italics, are transformed into hired employees of the state, which consists of the armed workers. All citizens become employees and workers of a single countrywide state syndicate. We already heard that, but this is the point. All that is required is that they should work equally, do their proper share of work, and get equal pay. The accounting and control necessary for this have been simplified by capitalism to the utmost and reduced to the extraordinarily simple operations which any literate person can perform of supervising and recording, knowledge of the 4 rules of arithmetic, and issuing appropriate receipts. So this is the technological rationality, by the way. You can hear that's not going to work. That's the technological rationality, I think, that Marcuse is talking about, not just the trucks and the factories and so on. But here we go. When the majority, that's in italics, when the majority of the people, that's the proletariat, by the way, is who he's talking about, begin independently and everywhere to keep such accounts and exercise such control over the capitalists, that's the main project, is to suppress their class enemies, now converted into employees, and over the intellectual gentry who preserve their capitalist habits, this control will really become universal, general, and popular, and there will be no getting away from it. There will be nowhere to go. Hence the totalitarian aspect of this. The whole of society, listen to this sentence, which is set out as its own paragraph, one sentence. The whole of society will have become a single office and a single factory with equality of labor and pay. Okay? So why did I call Communism 2.0, which Lenin ushered in, industrial communism? The whole of society will have become a single office and a single factory with equality of labor and pay. But this factory discipline, which the proletariat after defeating, I scrolled too far. But this factory discipline, which the proletariat after defeating the capitalists, after overthrowing the exploiters, will extend to the whole of society, is by no means our ideal or our ultimate goal. It is only a necessary step for thoroughly cleansing society of all infamies and abominations of capitalist exploitation and for further progress. Remember, progress means going toward communism, right? So all of society is going to be turned into one giant factory that's going to be run with massive factory discipline, a huge syndicate that's going to be controlled by the armed workers, aka the workers' councils, the Soviets, who are going to be in ideological lockstep with the state that actually owns and controls the production and distribution of everything. That's the program. That's how Lenin has laid out industrial communism, or Communism 2.0, which is also what I call state communism, which is somehow going to get to this point of withering away. Remember, the point of that is to wither away the thing he just described. He says, from the moment all members of society, or at least the vast majority, have learned to administer the state themselves, have taken this work into their own hands, have organized control over the insignificant capitalist minority, over the gentry who wish to preserve their capitalist habits, and over the workers who have been thoroughly corrupted by capitalism. From this, it's still about smashing class enemies. When we actually smash our class enemies, from this moment, the need for government of any kind begins to disappear altogether. The more complete the democracy, the nearer the moment when it becomes unnecessary. The more democratic the state, which consists of the armed workers, the Soviets, and which is, quote, no longer a state in the proper sense of the word, that's quoting Engels, the more rapidly every form of the state begins to wither away. That's the vision. That's how you get to communism, according to Lenin. You have to have the whole society work like a brutally enforced state factory where everybody in it is a worker who does what the workers' councils or the Soviets tell them to do, with the party in control of everything. And when that's brutal enough, and everybody's doing their part without having to be forced to any longer, then you can get the state to start withering away, and communism might come out of this socialism. He says, for when all have learned to administer and actually independently administer social production, and that means keeping your neighbors on track with the communist program. Independently keep accounts and exercise control over the parasites, the sons of the wealthy, the swindlers, and the other guardians of capitalist traditions. In other words, smash class. Everybody's going to smash class enemies. Everybody's going to keep their neighbors in line. The escape from this popular accounting and control will inevitably become so incredibly difficult, such a rare exception, and will probably be accompanied by such a swift and severe punishment. For the armed workers are practical men and not sentimental individuals. They don't care if they kick your ass, and they will scarcely allow anyone to trifle with them, that the necessity of observing the simple fundamental rules of the community will very soon become a habit. So in other words, the state will begin to wither away when it is actually not just totalitarian, but totalitarian operating at every level, including from you, but in particular, all held together by the KGB and the Cheka, the secret police. The armed workers are practical men and not sentimental intellectuals, and they will scarcely allow anyone to trifle with them. He says, when all of that is so overwhelming, and everybody's smashing class enemies, and everybody's independently keeping track of their labor and their needs, and everybody's independently administering social production, in other words, keeping everybody on the social program of and cultural program of communism, then he says that the simple fundamental rules of the community will become a habit. And he closes the chapter by saying, then the door will be thrown wide open for the transition from the first phase of communist society to its higher phase, and with it the complete withering away of the state. So how do we get the withering away of the state and from socialism to communism? We know how we get from capitalism to socialism. The workers are supposed to unite, engage in a bloody revolution, and steal the means of production of society, man, and everything else. Nature too. And then there's to set up this thing called a dictatorship of the proletariat. And when does that wither away? How does that wither away? By becoming so pervasive and totalitarian that it forces everybody through the inversion of praxis to believe the communist religion. And then, only then, will it work, and no man knows the hour, and no man knows the date. That's communism. That's what Lenin said communism was about, and there's so many parallels to what we're dealing with now. But you get this sense that totalitarian control becomes a necessity. I think that what we're dealing with is an opt-in version, a soft totalitarianism, not the brutal barrel of a gun version of totalitarianism. But sometimes people I know get raided by the FBI, and so it's really hard to say if it's all that soft. It's certainly softer than Lenin and his Cheka were, but it's not all that soft. But I wanted to present to you Lenin and the thoughts about the development of communism, the question of, like I said, how Marx says we go from capitalism to socialism is very simple. Violent, bloody revolution led by the workers to seize the means of production of society. In other words, to steal everything, literally to steal the entire society from people and put them under a dictatorship of proletariat control for their own and the greater good. And then the question that was left then is, well, how do you get from socialism to communism? How do you effect the magical transformation from a brutal dictatorship to a stateless classless society that's a utopia where everybody can take according to their needs, and only as long as everybody just willingly and happily contributes according to their ability and everything's great? How do you do that? Well, the answer is through, they don't know. Actually, that's what Lenin actually said. We have no idea. But we know that it comes through organizing the entire state like a totalitarian factory that everybody works for, and force them to be socialists until it becomes a habit, and then the state will wither away. We don't want that. I think we need to understand what we're dealing with, which is communism, and that we need to resist this, we need to expose this, and we need to show up and say no every opportunity that we get while we still have that opportunity, because they certainly lost it very fast when the Bolsheviks took over in Russia. And if you read Alexander Solzhenitsyn, where he says, if they knew that they had no actual hope, then they would have stood up sooner and fought much differently than they did. we have to prevent ourselves from getting in that circumstance. So I want to share with you Lenin.